unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives,
a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha. I'm your host, Milan and Pramit of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. The credibility of India's official statistics has hit rock bottom in recent years. This is the conclusion reached by my guest on the show today, Pramit Bhattacharya. In a lengthy essay in the Mint newspaper published last May, Pramit documented the inside story of the decline of India's globally renowned statistical system and the serious consequences this has had on the Indian economy. Today, economists openly question the sanctity of India's GDP growth figures. The government has chosen to scrap or suppress economic surveys it has conducted when they have thrown up inconvenient truths. And the apex statistical body in the country has been hollowed out by mass resignations. Joining me today in the Hindustan Times studio to talk much more about this is Pramit Bhattacharya, data editor at Mint, which is a publication of the Hindustan Times. At Mint, Pramit leads the Plain Facts team, which is one of the most highly regarded data journalism units in the country. I'm pleased to welcome him on the show for the first time. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, Milan, for having me here, and really look forward to this podcast.
So this is a long and somewhat sordid story, so it's kind of hard to know, where do you start? But let me try and start from the beginning, at least from post-independence India. You've pointed out in several of your writings that shortly after independence, India's first prime minister established one of the most sophisticated professional statistical agencies really anywhere in the world at the time. Tell us a bit more about this legacy and the motivations of Nehru in constructing it.
Yes, so to understand that, one needs to step back a little behind what happened in the run-up to the independence. And unlike in the West, where the development of statistics was in the backdrop of the World War, here it was a legacy of the anti-colonial movement itself. The British Raj, of course, helped organize statistics because they wanted to know more and control their subjects. Also, they wanted information on trade and income so as they could design land revenue, taxes, and so on. But also because the British felt, they must give an account back to the home country, Britain, about how beneficial their rule was. That allowed people like Nauroji and others to use those very same statistics to critique the British Raj. In fact, Nauroji was the first to come up with some kind of a poverty line, although he didn't use that term. T.N. Srinivasan used that in an EPW paper when he first talked about it. And that was the work that others, including economists from the Bombay University, built on to basically show that how the national income of the country is not growing at the rate at which it should be, or in fact, in certain sectors, it was shrinking. So Khambata and Shah had this wealth and taxable capacity in India monograph, which talked about it in the 1920s. And around the same time, or just after that, V.K.R.V. Rao, who was then at Cambridge, he produced the first sort of set of estimates for what India's national income was. And his motivations were similar to Khambata and Shah, although he was much more careful in what he could say based on the limited paucity of the data. Also in the 1930s, there was a move within the Congress party led by Nehru that India needs a planned model of development. And Nehru was, of course, impressed with what the Soviets were doing. And one of the things was their use of data. So other than the United States, it was the Soviets who made a lot of innovations in statistics at that time. And this was also the time when Mahalanobis had started the ISI in Presidency College. This physicist by training had started doing sampling. And, sampling, random sampling was something that just come up around the time of 1925-26. And Mahalanobis had started this journal called Sankhya, which actually contributed to the development of the whole journey of sample service globally, and he took part in a lot of international debates on these issues. And all this came together also with the Bombay Plan, because at that time, the Tatas, the Birlas, the who's who of Indian industry also felt
The sort of big business houses
Yes.
who were extremely prominent, still prominent today, but very
Yes.
prominent at the time of independence.
Yes, they all agreed with the Nehru Ambedkarite sort of vision that India should be a planned economy, and it also fit in with the global consensus at that time that developing countries do need to have a big state-led push. For that, you need planning, and for planning, you need data. So that was the backdrop under which V.K.R.V. Rao, Gadgil, who was then at Gokhale, who had set up Gokhale, and Mahalanobis, who had set up ISI, all came together to produce the first report of official report of national income just after independence, and that was supplemented by the appointment of Mahalanobis as the honorary statistical advisor to the cabinet. And all of this was premised on the fact that there were a lot of statistical gaps, and you need to fill them piece by piece. And Mahalanobis basically took the lead in setting up all these institutions: the Central Statistical Office, the NSS, the National Sample Survey, the ASI, the Annual Survey of Industry. So all of this came up in a very short span of time between the 1947 and 1952, 53, 54. This was the period when all of these things happened. Today it seems almost unbelievable that there's so many statistical innovations, and at the same time Mahalanobis was also instrumental in setting up similar surveys across the world. I mean, he in the first UN Statistical Commission conference, he was the one who suggested there should be a subcommittee on statistical sampling, and that was set up, and he was asked to chair it.
Let me interrupt you there, because I think this, in some ways, is the untold story, and maybe you'll tell it one day. The Nobel laureate Angus Deaton, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics a few years ago, once said, and you quote this in one of your pieces, "Where Mahalanobis and India led, the rest of the world has followed." And so I'm wondering if you could just kind of step back for a second and take us back to that time and tell us, what impact did India's statistical systems, all of this innovation you mentioned, which happened between 47 and 54, roughly that time period, what impact did that have on the rest of the world and how they thought about data and surveys and, the kind of core fundamentals you need in any functioning economy?
Right. So some of them were pretty much theoretical innovations that came to be applied in statistical surveys. So ISI was the first to use the pilot survey. Okay, and this is something the world picked up from us. Similarly, there were other concepts like Mahalanobis used a strategy of interpenetrating subsamples, where basically you divide up the sample in a random manner and assign different agencies so that you can cross-check while doing the survey whether the survey results are right or not. So
it's sort of cross-referencing in real time, in other words.
Yes. So this was something that Mahalanobis innovated and the rest of the world picked up. And ISI itself became a hub. I mean, along with UNESCO, ISI became an international statistical education center. So I think most of the developing world surveys that happened, some of which were funded by UN agencies, some of which were funded by the World Bank and so on, happened because of the charter laid out by the United Nations Statistical Commission, the sampling subcommittee which Mahalanobis headed, and they came up with a book or a reference manual actually of how to do these surveys. And also because ISI played a leading role in incubating many of these surveys from Africa, from other parts of Asia and so on. In Asia, we are definitely number one. And there's a famous incident narrated by Arunabh Ghosh in one of the 2016 History of Science paper, where he narrates how the Chinese premier had come for a 45-minute session with Mahalanobis to understand how India was doing, what it was doing.
This would have been sometime in the 1950s?
Yeah, 56. And the meeting ran on for more than 2 hours because, he had so many questions, and he clearly understood that India was far ahead. And within 2 days of his leaving, there was a huge delegation from China with Chinese statisticians staying at ISI for close to 2 months to understand what ISI was doing.
So I want to kind of bring us to the recent past. If we kind of fast forward the tape 60, 70 years, and, this gets very technical very fast. So without getting too much into the weeds, I want to ask you about India's decision to update its method of calculating GDP. And I think that happened back in 2015. This has been a global story now, not just an Indian one. As I understand it, this was something that had been in the works for some time. It began under the previous Congress-led UPA government. But I think it is an understatement to say that India's new GDP numbers were immediately criticized as being unrealistic. It prompted some critics to even allege that perhaps the government had intentionally fudged the numbers. Others said, no, this wasn't about deliberate fudging. It really was about methodological issues. So give us a kind of snapshot at a sort of 30,000-foot level. What actually happened back in 2015 inside the statistical bureaucracy? Because that really was seen as a kind of turning point where you had a set of numbers, we all kind of agreed upon them more or less with some margin of error, and now immediately question marks arose.
Yes, so I'm more sympathetic to the view that this was a methodological miscalculation, more than deliberate fudging. Also because the work spanned across two different regimes, and much of it was already decided by the time the new regime came to power. There were acts of omission rather than commission from the side of the new government, and which we can discuss in some time. But on the new GDP series itself, I think the real problem was how do you use the new benchmarks, the System of National Accounts 2008, which had come up, and which demanded a lot of microdata, a lot of detailed sort of both price and output data, which India frankly didn't have. Plus, India did start building up a more exhaustive database on the corporate sector, but which at that time was fairly untested, and which even now has not been opened up to the public, and whose statistical properties, frankly, we don't know.
Right, so it's kind of a black box a little bit.
Yes. So there were very valid scientific questions raised about whether we should use it, how we should use it, and so on. And I don't think till the deliberations lasted, there was a consensus within the subcommittee that was supposed to look into it. And when the results came out, they were based on one set of subcommittee members. So naturally, those who didn't agree, and in particular the independent member who didn't agree, went out and said that, look, I didn't agree, and they went on without my approval and even without my knowledge. So there was also a process violation, if you know what. So that basically raised a lot of red flags in the academic community, among journalists, among researchers, and even the central bank governor Raghuram Rajan, the chief economic advisor Arvind Subramanian, they raised red flags publicly about
publicly. I remember the press conference where the central bank governor said he was sort of unsure about how to interpret this. The chief economic advisor at the time, Arvind Subramanian, said he was puzzled by the data.
So if I may sort of get it down to its essence, there are two main issues there. One, as I said, is the use of that untested database. It's not anybody's case, or not most people's case, that database shouldn't have been used at all.
Okay.
It was a question of how, when, after what kind of testing.
Yes.
That is number one. Number two is the use of deflators. So you moved from a system where you had fairly aggregate level deflators of broad sectors to fairly disaggregated.
And when you say, just for our non-economically literate listeners, what do you mean by deflators?
Okay, so suppose suppose a company is producing something which was worth 100 rupees 10 years back, and today it is worth 200 rupees. Now, part of that change is simply because prices have moved.
Inflation.
It's inflation. So if you know that 50% of that is because of that, then you can say that from the 100 to 150 jump,
you can kind of discount things.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's a discount.
Yeah.
Now, to do that, you need very good price data.
Right.
And which we don't have for producer prices.
Okay.
India doesn't have a producer price index.
Meaning we have decent data for consumer prices, but not producer prices.
Yes. So in many of those categories which demanded producer prices, what we ended up using was wholesale price index.
Okay.
Which, according to most economists and statisticians, is a very unreliable proxy. And also in India, there are a lot of legacy issues in the way they are calculated. The data sourcing itself is a problem, and which is also one reason why we moved from WPI to CPI when it came to inflation targeting. That the CPI was seen as more robust, more up-to-date compared to WPI. But we continue to use WPI in many, and especially in services, this is seen to be a problem. And in a period when you have low oil prices, when the deflator is negative, and maybe in some cases artificially so, then it jacks up your real growth numbers.
So if I had to summarize, the government of India went through a process to try to modernize its GDP calculation.
Yes.
This was in line with best practices around the world. The issue became that you had a firm level sort of database, microdata, that was untested. We still today don't know what's in it. Second is you have this issue with prices. And then in the formulation of this, you also have this process foul or violation where some people feel like this was not the true kind of consensus. Now, that's one set of issues about GDP in 2015. Then there was a second issue,
Yes.
which was about the GDP back series, or other words, applying the new GDP methodology retrospectively, right?
Yes.
Now, on this, many independent economists, who are not affiliated with a political party, they're not viewed as activists in any way, immediately began questioning the credibility of this data, which led to a flurry of charges that the data had been politicized. On this particular issue, do you think these charges have any merit?
Yes, I do think. I mean, they are far more, we can call them, they're far more dubious compared to the...
So there's a real distinction to be made between what happened in 2015 with the first change and what happened in this back series.
Yes. And remember that the back series came about after the National Statistical Commission had already looked into the issue. There was a committee that gave 3 different kind of suggestions on how we could do it. CSO was part of that committee. Some of the same officials who were part of those deliberations later came up with another report 3 months down the line saying that no, this is the correct back series,
Okay.
and the National Statistical Commission one was wrong, in which they were also party to
Right.
it. And for some reason, the Advisory Committee of National Account Statistics, though there was disagreement within that meeting where they approved the back series, that disagreement, you won't find it in any official record. But I can say this, and I mean, I have confirmed this from multiple sources, that there was a lot of unease within the Advisory Committee of National Account Statistics on approving a back series with the same committee members, with the same CSO official who had 3 months down the line said something else.
So the former chief economic advisor of the Modi government, Arvind Subramanian, came out last year after he had left that
Yes.
position with a working paper in which he estimated that the true GDP growth figures in India are at least 2.5 percentage points lower than
Right.
what the government is claiming. He's come on the show and talked about it. Government experts who are associated with this Economic Advisory Council of the Prime Minister's office produced a very sharply worded critique, essentially trying to undermine Subramanian's analysis, saying, there may be issues, but this is way off the mark. Few Indians have studied the nuts and bolts of India's GDP numbers as closely as you have. How convincing is Arvind Subramanian's analysis? Is he on to something fundamental?
I definitely think he's onto something. So there are 2 parts to his argument. One is the diagnostic part, where he compares the output indicators with other set of indicators. And then he does a sort of cross-country comparison that if these indicators grew at so much pace, then compared to, if we use the benchmark of other countries, then where India's growth should be. So in the first part where he clearly points out that there is a mismatch between this has been said by other people as well, but no one has said it in as robust a comprehensive manner as Arvind did.
So in other words, like if you're saying GDP is this, in normal times, this is what exports would look like,
Yes.
this is what investment would look like, this is what electricity generation would look
Right.
like, and so on and so forth. And here is what is happening now, and there's a real divergence between some of these other indicators, which are
Yes.
standard measures of an economy's health, and GDP. So there's
Yes.
some weird divergence going on.
Yes, and which are also inputs. Some of them are also inputs into the GDP process. Maybe they're being inputted in the wrong way, or there are deflators which are making them go off the mark. So on that, I think there is a fair amount of consensus in the private sector, among other economists. I mean, the two other chief economic advisors, right, Raghuram Rajan and Shankaracharya, who have come out and said that no, we also don't believe that this is right, and the skeptics are right, and the numbers should be questioned. Now, coming to whether it is 2.5 or 3, I think we should recognize that Arvind in his first paper himself, he was fairly straightforward in saying that, look, this is one estimate, right? And any other model might generate another. And you need an independent sort of task force to look into it, because unless you have the raw data, unless you have access to all the rates and ratios they used, and till this date, they have not come up with the detailed manual that they used for the earlier series, where they explain each and every step of what they do.
Right.
So they have just released a short manual just after the 2015 release, but till date, they have not come up with that. They have not released the raw data. So it's very difficult for an outsider to do, get at a sort of validate very closely what. But given what we have, Arvind's estimate could be one sort of estimate. There are others who have come up with slightly lower estimates. Anantha Nageshwaran, who is now in the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, said that he wrote a piece in Mint where he said he did a similar exercise, and his estimate was it was somewhere between 1 to 1.5% lower, if I recall correctly. So one can argue about where exactly it would be, and I don't think I am qualified to sort of come at a precise answer. But there is definitely multiple estimates, and all of them indicate that perhaps we are overestimating reality.
And I think there was a little bit of confusion in the popular discourse. My interpretation of what Arvind was arguing is, Arvind, am not proposing a new way of GDP estimation. What I am trying to do is say, does this pass the smell test? Yes. And according to looking at this range of indicators, it doesn't seem to. Now, let's move a little bit further in time. Late 2018, India's National Statistical Commission, which is an agency which is quite important, but not something that's in the public consciousness on a day-to-day basis, but it became the subject of a lot of headlines, including in your newspaper, when 2 of its members abruptly resigned, and the reason given for the resignation was that there had been undue government influence on the publication of a national sample survey report on jobs, which contained data pointing to a massive surge in unemployment. And I'm wondering, now that you look back at what happened, what was the kind of significance of these resignations, and where do things stand at this important, perhaps understudied, under-reviewed statistical agency today? So
I would think that the release of the non-release of the unemployment report, that was the last straw on the camel's back. Tensions had been building up all along. And as I had documented in the long story that I did on the statistical system, I think it was called How India Failed in Stats, the conflict between the Ministry of Statistics and the National Statistical Commission began almost the day the National Statistical Commission was set up. And the chief statistician and the National Statistical Commission have not been able to see eye to eye on many issues. And the National Statistical Commission, which was promised to be a statutory body, was never given statutory backing. So there is no law. I mean, there's a new draft bill, we can talk about it later, that has come up, which is a version of an old draft bill, but it never came. And there were different incidents at different points of time that contributed to the growing unease. And one of the factors, in fact, was the draft statistical bill, because there was a draft statistical bill in May 2018, and the National Statistical Commission members of that time, including Mr. Mohan, who was a member, felt that they should have been consulted earlier. And the ministry's position, or some officials of the ministry, felt that this was merely a reiteration of what the National Statistical Commission itself had recommended back in 2011. And at that time, they had set up a committee led by the legal luminary, Mr. Madhav Menon. And it was a detailed committee report outlining what the National Statistical Commission should do, what should be its powers, the relationship with government, its corporate structure, everything. So the draft bill took off from the Madhav Menon committee report, and so that was one of the issues of contention. The other was relating to very routine administrative sort of stuff, but which can become irritants. So the National Statistical Commission, the chairman has the rank of the Minister of State, if I am not mistaken. But almost in every other thing, the chief statistician controls everything. Even if they want to get something printed out, they have that font trick is essentially approved by the chief statistician. So, and these are senior statisticians. So it may be almost demeaning for them to be on this seemingly prestigious post and yet have very little powers, very little control over how the statistical system is run. So there were all these undercurrents of tension from quite long. And when it came to that report, I think this was a red line. They were unwilling to sort of accept, and things boiled over, and
We sort of got these resignations.
Yes.
So there was another suppressed NSSO report, National Sample Survey report. This one was on household consumption.
Yes.
And that was
It's still suppressed.
Still suppressed, but leaked to the press, at least partially.
Yes.
And it showed that for the first time in decades, poverty in India is rising rather than falling. Now, what I find interesting about this is that even some critics of the government's handling of data, including Arvind Subramanian,
Yes.
have argued publicly that an absolute decline in household consumption over the past 6 years is a hard pill to swallow.
Right.
And the government, for its part, chose to just junk the survey and say, we're going to basically have a do-over rather than release its findings.
Right.
So I'm wondering, does the government maybe have a point that, something doesn't quite seem so right with this data, so we're going to essentially do this over in the future so we get a better handle on what's happening?
So a couple of things there. One, this is a issue of debate whether to what extent it correctly captures the extent of consumption. Now, given whatever is out there in the public domain, and given whatever I've heard from survey enumerators and statisticians I have spoken to, I do not see any major difference in the way the survey was carried out in 2017-18 versus the way it was carried out in 2011-12. There are issues of non-response, especially in urban areas. It's very difficult. The survey questionnaire is quite long. It takes 2 hours, so people don't often have enough time and so on. But it is more of an urban problem rather than a rural problem. And this is something you face even as a researcher or journalist,
Sure.
right? If you travel to the countryside, people usually have more time, are
Right.
willing to give you more time to talk. So the enumerators face the same issues. And in urban India, the consumption has actually gone up, even in real terms. It's in rural India that the consumption has gone down. And if you look at other indicators of just for the rural sector,
Okay.
things do really look bad. In rural wages have been declining or not growing at any significant rate for a long time. You have 3 droughts in this 2011-12 to 17-18 period. You also have fairly modulated rise in minimum support prices, which in the pre-2011-12 period was fairly dramatic. You saw fairly dramatic increases.
And these are the guaranteed prices that farmers get for the
yes.
crops.
Yeah. So there is a whole host of factors going on in rural. So I don't know whether to what extent it is on the mark or off the mark, but there are other correlates which suggest that things are not all that rosy. So even if there is so the direction what it suggests may be right.
Right.
And the only way to sort of arrive at a closer approximation of the truth would be to do another survey, and that is what the government should have done. They should have released this and said that, look, perhaps 2017-18 was a abnormal year, also because it came just after demonetization and GST. The informal sector was also sort of badly hit. But to do that, they would have to accept that these were policy errors or misadventures, and misadventure in case of demonetization and bad implementation, say, in case of GST. Perhaps they didn't want to do that, and that led to a sort of knee-jerk reaction. And if you look at what happened since that, it clearly shows that this was not well thought through. That even the decision to suppress the report, I think, happened on that very day when the Business Standard published the first set of findings, the headline findings about the consumption decline. And as I've reported, after that there was a phishing exercise where they sent letters to enumerators or their supervisors asking them for critical.
Tell us what went wrong, right? Give us some evidence, ex post.
Yeah, so this was clearly. I mean, I think they wanted to come up with a report, but after we wrote about it and so on, so that thankfully.
And we should give a shout out here to Somesh Jha, the dogged reporter from the Business Standard, who broke both of these stories, first on the suppressed jobs report, then secondly on the still suppressed consumption report. That really broke this open in a
absolutely
new way.
Fantastic.
And
if I may just add, so Somesh has done an absolutely terrific job in this, and I must also give a shout out to a lot of committed people within the statistical system itself. Without whistleblowers, without people who are willing to share their expertise and knowledge, we couldn't have done the kind of stories. Neither Somesh nor my explanatory pieces or follow-ups or anything of that would have been possible. And they, as Pranab Sen had pointed out in one of his pieces, have stoutly refused to toe the government line on many issues, including on the consumption report. So while the ministry said that an expert committee had vetted and said that don't release it, the actual committee report didn't say any of that thing. And it merely said there are some discrepancies, but it has been there even in earlier times. So there are a lot of committed statisticians in the system, and it is only a small section of the leadership which has not been able to give the statistical system the kind of leadership it deserves.
A new committee was formed to review everything that's happening within India's statistical system. It includes many individuals who've been quite prominent in expressing disagreement with how this government has handled data. I'm wondering what this body is doing in specific terms, and do you think that this is kind of a significant intervention?
It's a good step, I would say, in the sense that they have accommodated even some critiques of the government. But it also tells us about how low our expectations are. Because even in the past, there have been members of the standing committees who have been fairly critical both of government policies as well as government statistics. There have been members of the standing committee on industrial statistics who have been fairly critical of the way IIP, for instance, works. It is just that in the present circumstances, it seems like a big deal. I don't think it is that big a deal, number one. And number two, the standing committees were always there. So it is just that there has been now a merger because the individual standing committee, so now there's no standing committee on industrial statistics. So they have all been merged together. And Pranab Sen was always, if I'm not mistaken, a member of one of the standing committees on the services sector. So, of course, he's also more open and forthright about many issues compared to others. So, but he was, even while he was criticizing some aspects of statistics, he continued to be a part of the, say, broader statistical establishment. Yes. So,
stepping back and kind of looking at the bigger picture, Pramit, I'm wondering, just in your independent assessment as a keen observer of what's been happening and a chronicler of what's been happening, how badly have recent events, whether it's the contested GDP numbers, whether it's accusations of fudging, scrapping, or suppression of large surveys, how badly have these hurt, sort of India's economic image? And what are the sorts of steps that could kind of right the state of affairs?
Yes. So, see, one way of answering this is that almost everyone who comes to meet me, the first thing they ask is, what do you think the real GDP number is? So
you might have the official number, and then you have the kind of in-house number.
Yes. So, and I think Pratap Bhanumehta also wrote about it in Indian Express piece, that when everyone begins with that question on the economy, then you know that,
And, I think you and I probably both have spoken with private investment houses in Bombay who say, we have our own estimate because we think it's at odds with the official number.
Yes. And even foreign investors, I know people from foreign institutional investors who are taking a relook at the entire thing. And see, this was one of the comfort factors about investing in India, that you could take the statistics at face value. Now they are being more careful.
Which is at odds, Faye, with China, where everybody
Yes.
has known for quite some time that you
Yes.
have a real number and then you have to
Yes.
apply some kind of discount
Yes.
factor to get to what the quote-unquote
Yes.
true number is.
Yes.
And that has not historically been true about India.
Yes, and that is the question being asked now, that is India becoming like China, and which I think is an unfair comparison, because despite all my criticism of this, the fact that I have lived to tell the tale, and the fact that there has been some response, even if grudging acceptance of some data quality issues, that itself says that we are not China. But yes, for someone who has a bird's eye view, they're right in asking whether the system is deteriorated so much that we have to do some of our own filtering, and many of them are doing it. So that says something, and even among the academic research community that is happening. So one is the investor, sort of how he or she considers his or her investments in India, and the other is how academics use or filter Indian data when they do their research. So both of that are happening. Is it a sort of irreversible slide? I don't think so. It can be reversed. But we certainly need to think hard about what are the new institutions or what are the tweaks in the current institutional structure that can bring about greater confidence, greater credibility in the statistical system. It is very evident that the current system is not working. And if you just have a chief statistician reporting to a minister who perhaps is not that much interested in statistics, and there's no independent oversight, there's no body overlooking or monitoring or even auditing statistical products, it's not a workable system, and it doesn't inspire trust. That much is very clear. Now, what is the relationship, what is the structure of that new body, whether the National Statistical Commission can perform that role, what its relationship should be to the government, those are things that need wider discussion and debate. But this is something we require to sort of set the house in order.
My guest on the show today is Pramit Bhattacharya. He's the data editor at Mint and leads the newspaper's Plain Facts team. Pramit, these are incredibly complex issues, so thanks for coming on the show and trying to break them down for those of us who are non-specialists, and look forward to reading your reporting on what happens next.
Thanks, Milan.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. You can find us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we referenced on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Production assistance comes from Megan Maxwell and Rachel Osnos. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Lauren Dueck is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.